Putin clearly in this speech was drawing a line and saying, we're not going to try anymore. We're just giving up on you, and we're going to make our own world in which we are the master.
It's one of Putin's harshest attacks on America in his 7-year term.
After that speech, we saw the first long-range nuclear bombers by Russia. We saw the devastating cyber attack in Estonia in 2007. We were starting to see steps taken that represented a Russia assertiveness that we had not seen. We did not necessarily understand that 2007 is the date where he wanted to stop that democratic encroachment.
The leaders of NATO begin a 2-day summit
It's
today.
been 6 years since the establishment of the NATO-Russia Council.
But Bush ignored Putin's warning,
Taken by this summit will affect the future of the alliance.
ratcheting up the conflict, encouraging Georgia and Ukraine, two former Soviet republics, to join NATO.
We must make clear that NATO welcomes the aspirations of Georgia and Ukraine for their membership in NATO.
The Russians were obviously very, very concerned that the Bush administration was moving towards allowing both Georgia and Ukraine to get into NATO, which was for them a huge red line.
Putin rushed to Bucharest to confront Bush.
There's this amazing moment. Putin shows up early and crashes the dinner with the NATO members. He has basically shown up as the skunk in the garden and challenging them for what they've done.
In a meeting later, Putin was adamant to Bush. Georgia, and especially Ukraine, were in his sphere of influence.
He leaned over and said, Ukraine is not a real country. He had no respect for the sovereignty of the Ukrainian people. We should have seen it earlier. Maybe we didn't want to see it, but it was clear if we had wanted to see it, the direction that President Putin was going.
Putin made it clear he wouldn't accept Bush's plan for Georgia and Ukraine.
It basically waved the red flag in front of the bull. It was extremely provocative for Russia. It provoked Russia and made Russia angry.
Just 4 months later, Putin attacked Georgia.
Russian troops backed by tanks and armored vehicles.
The Russians were prepared and perhaps even eager for a conflict with Georgia.
There appeared to be little to stop the troops in their
And part of that was motivated by, we're going to show the Georgians that getting too close to NATO has a price.
Russian planes again bombing Georgian.
Putin seized and held nearly 5,000 square miles of Georgian territory.
Another town is burning. More civilians have been killed.
From Putin's point of view, this wasn't just about Georgia.
Fierce battle broke out today on the fringe of the
This was about Ukraine. This was about what he saw to be the West's interest and, eventual expansion of NATO, potentially to include Ukraine and Georgia.
Some of those Georgian soldiers were saying, where is the United States?
As the war broke out, Vladimir Putin and George W. Bush happened to be at the Olympics in Beijing.
Bush finds himself at the Olympics sitting in the same row as Putin. He has his wife Laura and the King of Cambodia move aside so he can sit next to Putin and talk about it. But he knows the cameras are on him. So he's trying not to make it a big visible confrontation. But he's telling Putin, what are you doing here? This is not right. You can't be doing this. And Putin is basically telling him to butt out.
The president who had looked into Putin's soul had now reached a different conclusion about just who Vladimir Putin was.
I remember the president saying, I don't know how, but we've lost him. Putin was going in a different direction, and there was little that the administration and President Bush's mind could do to put Putin back on that course.
Nearing the end of his presidency, Bush would leave the increasing conflict with Putin to his successor.
They let Vladimir Putin arguably get away with it in Georgia. One message that Putin clearly takes from that in hindsight is that he is able to use the military as a tool of achieving his political ends outside the borders of Russia, and that the West will complain and lecture, but basically will let him get away with it. That's a terrible message, and I think it is the prologue for the Ukraine disaster.
All Americans can celebrate, red or blue, black or white.
First African American president of the United States.
President Obama is set to land in Russia.
Less than a year later, Vladimir Putin would meet newly elected Barack Obama face to face,
President Obama has a big meeting ahead.
sizing up his third American president.
Shadows of the Cold War will loom over his summit.
I remember their first meeting in July of 2009 at Putin's dacha, just outside Moscow. They're much different personalities. President Obama's initial question, about 10 seconds, led to a 45-minute, monologue by Putin.
Putin is extraordinarily calm, matter-of-fact. He doesn't get ruffled. He may say hard things, but he says them in a very calm, almost matter-of-fact way. Unfortunately,